Hello. Hello.
Hallo allesammans og hjertelig velkommen til dette tiltaket til KFS. Bare en liten ombering for sannsynligene bare nå. Det er tøknen jeg ikke vet at jeg lov da. Hette det første tiltaket av 3 måneder som KFS skipa 4, hette torskveldet og 2 til kommende. Vi har en iverordnede temaen som Kristna, trúgvin, skeilig. Og spurningar som vi vil gjøre i kvöld hessen her Niðurger, Kristna, trúgvin, kvinnur. Justin Jochen i kvöld en som heter Rebecca McLaughlin, og hon fer at døyla sinna mening om hette her evne. Hon født og oppvaksen i Bretlandet, men så i 2008 hever hon bo i Amerika. Hon lyser PhD av Cambridge University, hon også lyser godfrøye av Oak Hill Seminary i London. Hon skriver regulert for The Gospel Coalition, og kanskje høve på nå til at hon, eller i hese sambandet, at hon skriver hese bøkene, som heter Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. Bøkken, hon var en rikve av listen i fjør for beste bøk til året. Blant annet var hon valgt som den beste i kategorien for apologetikk og evangelisering i Christianity Today. I kveld så får vi til havna Samrøða, eller for havna Samrøða vi Rebecca, etter evne, som teker støy i kapitlen i bøkene. Ta fyrir at taka cirka en liten halvan tøyma, og så taka den til en liten steg, og at han at det, så færa vi ha et Q&A, eller her vi færa ha spurningar og svær fra hitjern her ute. Medan jeg tås vi, Rebecca, hvis det akkur som tid feien vil jeg hava henne svær på, jeg kan spyrja henne, så skriv til Niðurger. De kunne senda spurningarna til 26 46 00. Jeg halte det skulle komme opp på skjermen nå, eller kjøtt. Jeg husker at sende spurningarna alle tøyner som de kommer opp på. Ikke bo i en samtale av livet, man kan alltid glömma att han spårningen som man är upprunalig. Hennes Samrøða ver av enskon, det var ikke noe teksting, det er live, men hvis det er anker som føler seg uttrykken og jeg skriver en spårning av enskon, så skal det ikke lette det for deg, skriver han bare av førskon, og så ver han omsetter Arne, han vil spurter til Rebecca. Jeg kan ikke garantere at alle spårningene kommer vi, men vi finner det. All right, so prøver the shift even längst. Tonight it is my pleasure to welcome Rebecca McLaughlin all the way from the US to, well, not to the Faroe Islands, but on the line to the Faroe Islands. Hello, Rebecca, it's good to see you.
Hello, I wish I was there in person. So much more fun.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to have you here. I'd have you sign my book. We'll have to do it some other time. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? I don't know if you recognized any of the words that I said.
I picked up Cambridge University and Edinburgh College.
Yeah. Can you tell us maybe about the book? How did the book come about?
Certainly, yes. So after studying English literature for a really long time and then studying theology for a few more years, I moved to America and I started working for an organization where I was doing a lot of work with Christian professors at leading secular universities, both in the US and in other countries. And after 9 years of doing that, I'd had conversations with some of the top Christian thinkers in the world in fields as diverse as physics to philosophy to history to psychology. And I started to realize that I had almost like a roadmap to where the conversation about Christianity is really at in the university. And I'd heard from some of the smartest people who were experts in all these fields about how they saw their personal faith in relation to their academic work. So I wrote Confronting Christianity in order to share that roadmap with other people. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense because I think a lot of the critical response, very positive. I think the overarching message was that this is a fresh approach. Maybe some of the questions we've heard before, but you approach them or you answer them in a really fresh way. I read the book in the spring and I really enjoyed it because of that fact.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, I think in terms of many issues that we face today, people think that the answer is for Christians to become less biblical, and I was trying to suggest that actually I think we need to become more biblical.
Yeah, that's a good approach. So the question tonight is the title of your chapter, Does Christianity Denigrate Women? And I mean, gender relations, all that sort of stuff is a very hot button issue at the moment with all sorts of, I read it's 30 years since Thatcher resigned. There's a female vice president in the States, or there will be, maybe, who knows. At least she received they received a lot of votes. So it's a very, very relevant topic. And you talk about, you mentioned now that this is something that the questions that you use in the book, or you talk about in the book, is something that people are talking about in universities at the moment.
Yes, I think one of the things that's fascinated me in the last couple of years, even as I've read around some leading non-Christian thinkers since writing my book, is recognizing more and more that things that you and I take for granted, actually, whether we identify as Christian or atheist or agnostic or some other sort of flavor of something, that many of us, especially who've grown up in in a Western context or context strongly influenced by Western thinking. And there are things that we assume to be sort of basic moral common sense that actually, if you look historically, turn out to be specifically Christian ideas. And one of these is the idea that men and women are actually equally valuable. We see that in the very first chapter of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, where God creates human beings, specifically male and female, in his image. Yeah. And then we see that thread sort of pursued through the scriptures, especially to where Jesus' treatment of women radically changed their status. And so the idea that, you know, we all agree, we kind of take as a basic common sense moral norm that male and female humans are equally morally valuable. That's actually a specifically Christian belief, rather than something that we can deduce from science or sort of secular philosophy somehow.
And I think it's really interesting. You spend a lot of time in the chapter talking about the Bible. And I know I've talked to like skeptics about the Bible, and they seem to think, you know, how could such an ancient text that's 2,000-3,000 years old, how can that be relevant in 2020? And what's your case for that?
A bunch of different angles we could take on that. One is to say, okay, what is the most widely believed set of beliefs in the world today? And the answer is Christian. About 31% of the world identify as Christians today, whether or not they'd be serious Bible believers or not, they'd certainly identify that way. Compare that with the number of people who would identify as atheist, agnostic, or of no particular belief system, and that's about 16%. So only just over half, or about half the number of people who would identify as non-believing or non-religious identify as Christian. So, you know, that's one way of looking at it. Say, well, it's relevant because actually it's the largest belief system in the world. The second one is Islam. There's another way of looking at it, of saying, okay, how is this relevant today? You know, do we really need this ancient book still to ground the idea that men and women are equally morally valuable? And I would say actually, absolutely yes. Because philosophically speaking, if we don't have the Bible to tell us that human beings are made in the image of God and that men and women are fundamentally equal, we actually don't have a strong philosophical account of what a human being even is. If we can do a scientific analysis of a human, you know, I can say, well, I'm this many atoms and molecules, or I'm this proportion, you know, this kind of atom versus that. I could even say I'm biologically a mammal, which is true. But the more that I've read of contemporary kind of secular philosophers and scientists, the more they're actually saying they don't believe in human beings any more than they believe in God. You know, they're not saying often that we are even kind of coherent moral agents who are making real decisions between right and wrong. They're often not saying that, like, our experience of having a mind that is sort of continuous over time, to where the thing that I think is me now is the same me as was me 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and will be me in 10 or 20 years time. There's actually very little philosophically and scientifically to ground even the reality of human beings being a thing, let alone this idea that all human beings, regardless of their gender or of their age or of their race or of their socioeconomic background, are fundamentally equal. And I read a really fascinating historical book recently by a British historian, he's not a Christian, called Tom Holland, called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Great book. And one of the things he's arguing is, you know, look at the Greco-Roman Empire into which Christianity was born. People didn't think men and women were equally morally valuable. That would have been a laughable idea. You know, men were clearly stronger than women, and men were clearly more important.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, if we can talk about the Bible for a little bit. I think there's a very prevalent idea out there that the Bible doesn't really have anything positive to say about women. And you can find some texts in there that some people have called, you know, texts of terror, some very, very negative, even brutal accounts about the detailed some treatment of women and some ideas. What do we do with texts like that?
So I mentioned Genesis chapter 1 already, where God creates men and women equal. What I haven't mentioned yet is Genesis chapter 3, which is a biblical account of how everything went wrong. And the fundamental claim is that human beings who are made in God's image and set up as sort of deputies to God, ruling over his creation, actually we all rebelled against God. And that's something that the Bible calls sin. And we see the impact, the chronic impact of sin all around our world today, but we also see it all through the scriptures. The Old Testament is an account of how God chose a particular people and started sort of growing that people over time. But it's also an account of all sorts of things which are sinful. And the reason that we know they're sinful is actually because the Bible tells us that they're sinful. It's one of the fascinating things, whether we're looking at terrible things done to women in the Old Testament, or whether we're looking at genocides and sort of violent acts done in warfare. The reason we identify those things actually as truly morally wrong is because we look at them through eyes that have been shaped by Christianity. So yeah, many things in the Bible, the scriptures are sort of giving an account of rather than commending. It's a sort of a diagnosis rather than a prescription. So some of the terrible things that are done to women in the Old Testament, there are all sorts of terrible things that different people do in the Old Testament, and it's not something that Christianity is commending. It's often something that we're actually meant to look at and say, oh my goodness, that's really bad. Yeah, so it's descriptive rather than prescriptive. Yeah, and I think we then, when we come to the New Testament, we see Jesus treating women in a way that was shocking to his contemporaries. I particularly love the Gospel of Luke. I mean, I love all of the four Gospels for different reasons, but one of the really interesting things about Luke's Gospel, if you sit down to read it through, is you find that men and women are often paralleled in Luke. And women, when there's a comparison made between the two, women always come out better. We see this from the beginning when we see two accounts of different sort of miraculous conceptions. One of Jesus's cousin, John the Baptist, whose parents were much too old to have children. And an angel appears to his father and says, you're going to have this baby. And Zechariah, the dad, or the would-be dad, sort of questions it. Well, how can this be? We're much too old to have children. And the angel Gabriel basically tells him off and says, you're not going to be able to speak until this happens. And then we see Gabriel appearing to Jesus' mother Mary and totally commending her. And so, she comes out of this angel encounter looking really good, and Zechariah comes out looking kind of bad. We see it through multiple conversations Jesus has with women, healings that he does for women. And then we see it at the end when in Luke, as in all the other Gospels, women are the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And this was at a time when the testimony of women wasn't really seen as credible. It'd be a bit like today if you wanted to tell somebody a really amazing, unbelievable, or sort of hard to believe story, and you said, yeah, a few children saw it happen. Well, you'd think, well, who's going to listen to a few children? They believe and say all sorts of things. People thought similarly about women's testimony in the first century. So we see, if you look through, Luke's gospel, you'll see time and again women being kind of lifted up even in comparison to men. And one of the fascinating things about Jesus's personal ministry and relationships with women is that he often takes particular time to welcome and engage with and show love and respect to women who would have been specifically rejected by his contemporaries. One famous example is in John's gospel, Jesus sits down and starts a conversation with a woman at a well in Samaria. And there are a few problems. Like, number one, the Jews hated the Samaritans. They would travel a long way to not even go through Samaritan territory. So number one, he shouldn't have been talking to her because she is a Samaritan. Number two, he shouldn't have been talking to her because she was a woman and he was, a respectable Jewish rabbi. He shouldn't have been having a one-on-one conversation with her. Number three, it turns out that he knew all along that she was a woman with a sort of sexually immoral past. And Jesus has with this woman the longest individual kind of theological conversation he has with anybody recorded in the Gospel of John. So we see all these episodes and moments where Jesus is sort of treating people who would have been rejected and despised by his contemporaries, he's treating them as sort of people he wants to seriously validate and spend his time on, which is highly surprising.
So you're saying that these stories that are very familiar to a lot of people, that we've kind of forgotten the cultural background, and as a result, we've forgotten some of the significance of what's actually going on.
Yeah, I think that's totally right.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite stories is folks who are familiar with the chapter in John's Gospel when Jesus raises his friend Lazarus from the dead. Mm-hmm. And it's particularly interesting because, the headline of the chapter is, Jesus raises Lazarus. But actually what we see is Jesus deliberately not coming when his sisters Mary and Martha call for him. Mm-hmm. And it seems as we walk through the chapter, that's because he wanted to have very particular conversations with them. And especially this conversation with Martha, where he says those famous words, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Mm. And so we have this sort of snapshot of his personal, tender relationship with one of his female friends, even before he then goes with Mary and Martha to weep by their brother's tomb, even though he knows he's going to raise him. The way that he validated women was completely countercultural and honestly changed the status of women from then on. Hmm.
There's a very prominent idea that, Jesus was a very good guy. He treated women really well. But after his death, resurrection, his ascension, as the church became a hierarchy and the apostles took over and so forth, that maybe particularly Paul is guilty of this, or blamed for it more specifically, that he sort of breaks, and he pumps the brakes, and the patriarchy is reintroduced, and then the future of the church was one that denigrated women, marginalized women. From then on. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, here as in a couple other places, I think Paul gets completely unfair bad press. Now, maybe it's worth going back to the beginning of the biblical story again, because one of the things that I as a Christian believe is that God didn't just sort of find men and women lying around and decide to sort of regulate them somehow, but he created us male and female on purpose. If you think about it, God could have made, one kind of human that reproduced asexually, or he could have, magically or miraculously created new humans every 20 years without having to bother with all this sort of male and female business. But instead, God intentionally creates male and female. And we see through the Old Testament and flowing into the New Testament, we start to get an understanding of why. In the Old Testament, we start to hear God describing himself as being like a loving, faithful husband, and Israel, his people, as being like an often unfaithful, sort of cheating wife. And then we see when Jesus steps onto the stage of human history, we see him declaring himself to be the bridegroom. Is one of the many ways in which Jesus actually said that he was stepping into the shoes of the creator, covenant God that we see in the Old Testament scriptures. So Jesus is the bridegroom. Well, who is his bride? In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul explains to us that human marriage, or Christian marriage at its best, is meant to be this little kind of scale model of Jesus' relationship with his church. And that's why Paul talks about men and women in marriage having different roles. And we often hear the first part of that. And I certainly remember when I first, as a student, started kind of grappling with this text. And it begins in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. I read that as a highly educated 21st century woman, and I was kind of appalled. I was like, what is this? I mean, just as you said, it seemed like Jesus had spent all this time lifting women up, and then here was Paul kind of pushing them down again. Yeah. But it was a little bit like, I don't know if folks have read that chapter in Genesis when God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and it sounds terrible. And I even had a friend who's reading through the Bible and stopped at that point because it was like, I can't believe in a God who would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son. But if you read on a few verses, you find that actually God intervenes and that he provides another sacrifice instead of Abraham sacrificing his son. And if we read a few verses on in Ephesians, we find that there's a completely different picture than we at first thought when all we hear is wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord. We hear this command to husbands: husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So what does that mean? It means husbands are to love their wives like Jesus dying on the cross for us. It means a husband is to prioritize his wife's needs above his own, giving up everything for her. So rather than it being this sort of wives submit and husbands kind of, oppress, or even wives submit and husbands lead, it's actually wives submit and husbands sacrifice. And it's not because, as sometimes, I've sometimes heard kind of pastors preach this passage and not actually listen to what Paul's saying. And people will say, well, wives submit because women are naturally more submissive than men, or husbands are naturally better leaders, or whatever. Actually, what the text says is wives submit because the church submits to Christ, and husbands sacrifice, love your wives as Christ loved the church, because that's what Jesus does. And that in marriage, we're kind of acting out this little drama of Jesus and the church, which is again why in Genesis chapter 2, we're told that a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and the two become one flesh. We see this picture then kind of coming into its fulfillment in Jesus's relationship with his church, and we are his body in a meaningful spiritual sense. And then in Revelation, at the end of the Bible, we see Jesus' marriage to his church, bringing heaven and earth back together. It's not about status and hierarchy. It's about picturing the gospel, the story of Jesus giving himself up for us. That's what we're doing in Christian marriage. And likewise, when it comes to the particular roles that are given, and Paul specifies this, the particular roles that are given to men and women in church, we tend to think in terms of status, but actually that's completely against how Jesus taught. Because when two of Jesus' disciples, James and John, came to him wanting like special leadership roles in his kingdom, he said to their mom who brought them along, he said, "You don't know what you're asking for. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink?" He's saying, what you're asking for isn't status, it's sacrifice. And he said that even the Son of Man himself, he himself didn't come to be served, but to serve and give up his life as a ransom for many. And so anyone in his kingdom who wants to be the first and wants to be leading must be the slave of all. So we bring all these non-Christian, like truly sort of non-Jesus-centric ideas of power and status and ruling over others to how we think about roles even within the church. And Jesus won't have any of it. And then we see, and I'll stop in a minute, I know I'm sort of ranting because I feel kind of passionate about this.
Yeah.
If you read, for example, Paul's letter to the Romans, and you read the last chapter 16, where he sort of greets various people, you see multiple women who he greets in glowing terms, including Phoebe, who delivered the letter. And he commends her as a servant of the Lord. He commends other women as workers in the Lord. He commends a married couple who risk their necks for him. He actually has an extremely high and validating view of women's gospel work. So this idea that Paul was kind of a misogynist who only wanted to push women down, I think is completely wrong.
So what do we do, someone might ask, with the very straightforward words of Paul where he says that I do not permit a woman to teach, that women are supposed to be silent in the church?
Yeah, I think there are contextual ways we need to look at that, because in the sweep of Paul's writings and the multiple letters that he wrote, there are other instances where he talks about, for example, women prophesying as if this were a good thing. So I think we need to understand this is something that he says in a particular context, and that it may play out differently in different kinds of contexts. I don't think he's putting a blanket prohibition on women sort of ever speaking theologically, because again, why would he partner with women so much in the gospel if that was what he was meaning. Why would he commend, the woman who is delivering his letter to the Romans and presenting it to them, if he didn't want women to have any part in speaking before others? I think theologians who I respect will take slightly different views on whether this means that women should preach in a sort of formal capacity in a church service on a Sunday. And I think it's valid to take a range of different views on that, depending on how people read particular words. But I don't think that it's, as I say, I don't think it's something that springs out of misogyny on Paul's part at all. I think it may spring out of his understanding that there are different, like, men and women fulfill different functions sometimes within the church. But I don't think it's grounded in misogyny.
Okay, if we can move on a little bit from the Bible, one really interesting historical point you make in the chapter is that in the first years of the church, maybe the first couple of centuries, women played a very significant role. Just like today, there were more women Christians or female Christians than male Christians, and that actually that was a point of critique from non-Christians at the time. This is a religion for the weak, for women and children. We can't take this seriously as a result. Yeah. Can you? What was it about Christianity that attracted women more than maybe men?
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable, really, because as far as historians can tell, the Greco-Roman Empire was very likely about 2/3 male. Due to a combination of women dying in childbirth and selective infanticide, like abandonment of little baby girls, which was seen, again, is one of the things which at the time nobody thought was morally a problem, to leave your babies out to die if you didn't want them, especially if they were girls.
Yeah.
So in a world that was probably 2/3 male, the early church seems to have been about 2/3 female. Now, what attracted women to Jesus then, I think, is the same as what attracts women to Jesus now. And it's the hope that he gives. It's the life that he offers. It's the equality that he grants. It's the fact that naturally people think of Christianity as being a belief system that only values women for the number of children they can have. For example, people sometimes have this idea. I don't see that in the scriptures at all. Not to say that women aren't valued for doing what women can uniquely do, which is give birth to and feed little babies. Is absolutely something that the Bible values, but it's certainly not the only thing that the Bible values about women. And it's interesting, as you mentioned, even today, globally there are more Christian women than men. And in particular, right now, the church in China seems to be one of the most rapidly growing Christian movements in the world, to where there will likely be more Christians in China than in America by 2025. And by 2060, China could even be a majority Christian country. There again, we have a world that is a country that is predominantly male due to selective abortion of girls, and a church that seems to be majority female. So yeah, it's fascinating to me that Christianity has always been, as much as anything else, a movement of and for women. And so this sort of idea that it's against women doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. You spent most of the chapter sort of on the defensive, if I could use that term. But towards the end, you sort of turn around and critique some of the stuff that's out there, specifically some of the promises that have been made recently about, as you say, freedom and happiness that maybe are post-Christian or secular culture, the promises to deliver women, but also men. What can you give us a summary of your critique?
Sure, yeah. So the sexual revolution of the 1960s was very much sold to us as the liberation of women.
Yeah.
The rationale was, for centuries, men have been finding ways to kind of sneak around Christian marriage and have commitment-free sex. And now, great news, thanks to the pill, women could as well. But what's fascinating is that in the years, in the sort of 60-odd years since the sexual revolution, at least in America and in other Western countries, women's self-reported happiness has actually declined. Now that's despite multiple advances in terms of freedom and opportunities and job opportunities, etc. So we have to wonder, why is this? And one of the big reasons is that commitment-free sex is actually a poison chalice. There's a lot of research to show that stable marriage is correlated with mental and physical health benefits for both men and women. But for women in particular, actually increasing our numbers of sexual partners is correlated with negative mental health outcomes. For example, more depression, sadness, suicidal ideation, drug abuse, etc. On the sort of flip side of that coin, some of the recent research that's been done on marriage and asking people to rate their sort of happiness in their marriage has shown that in America, at least, highly religious women married to highly religious men are the happiest folks in town. Actually, the second happiest kinds of wives are so highly religious women married to highly religious men with kind of traditional gender roles, happiest. Second happiest is religious women married to religious men with non-traditional gender roles. Then, secular women in secular marriages kind of coming in significantly under in terms of happiness relative to religious women. And the most kind of perplexing thing is that secular women in traditional gender role marriages are actually the least happy. So it seems like it's not the magic isn't necessarily in the traditional gender roles. The magic is in the religious nature of the marriages. There's even, I was reading research earlier this week showing that highly, like, men and husbands and wives who read the Bible together outside of church and engage in various sort of religious practices beyond even going to church on a Sunday actually have the best sort of sex life satisfaction of anyone. So again, this idea that look at these poor women, these poor religious women, in these terribly oppressive religious marriages. Actually, turns out that the people who secular folk are feeling sorry for are the happiest and the most sexually fulfilled people around.
Yeah, so given the definition of happiness on the secular side, actually the religious people are happiest.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of heartbreaking, really. I was reading a study earlier this year, which was looking at suicide rates between women who attend church once a week or more and women who never go. And it turns out that women who attend church at least weekly are 5 times less likely to kill themselves than women who never do. This is research done by the Harvard School of Public Health. They've also looked at what's called deaths of despair. So that's looking at suicide, drug abuse, and alcohol-related deaths. And women who go to church once a week or more have a sort of 70% less likely to die deaths of despair than women who never go. For men, the difference is about 33%, which is sort of interesting, but it's actually a stronger effect for women than it is for men.
So all these promises made, as you said, 60 odd years ago, that the sexual revolution was said to be able to deliver, it has severely under-delivered.
Yeah.
Another aspect of this is the abortion question. According to a lot of people, feminist activists, abortion is absolutely fundamental when we're talking about women's rights, women's freedom. We can't really talk about feminism or freedom for women without abortion. How do you approach this super difficult topic?
Yeah, I was actually writing about that question just this morning in a new book that I'm working on. As you say, for a long time, abortion and the right to choose an abortion has been seen as the central plank in women's rights. In fact, I think it rots away at their foundation. I think the central plank of women's rights actually is the cross of Jesus. Now that may sound crazy, so let me just explain for a minute. First, as we've seen, it was how Jesus treated women was what changed the status of women from being seen as clearly inferior and sex proving. Actually, in the Greco-Roman world, men having sex with women kind of proved women's inferiority in men's minds. So not only sort of historically do we see how women have kind of been elevated by Christianity, But actually, if we think about the ways in which we talk about unborn babies today, if there is no God who created us and who said that he created men and women in his image, then the baby in the mother's womb is just a collection of atoms and molecules, just a sort of bundle of cells. But actually the mother is as well. Because if there is no God who made us in his image, then as Israeli historian, atheist Yuval Noah Harari puts it, human beings have no natural rights, just as hyenas, chimpanzees, and spiders have no natural rights. There's no reason for us to be seeing ourselves as infinitely valuable, and certainly not sort of seeing women as especially valuable if there is no God to undergird these strange beliefs we have. In fact, Harari, he's a global bestseller, best-selling author with his book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, and he says that the idea of human rights, of which women's rights is sort of a subset, that this is a Christian fiction. He uses that language specifically, and he says, if we don't believe in the Christian God, why would we believe in this strange idea of human equality? And so I think it's true. I think if we pull out Christianity, we think it's a little bit like, I don't know if you guys ever play that game Jenga, where you have to you put together these little wooden blocks, and they build a tower, and you can kind of take blocks out of the bottom and put them on top to build a higher tower. We often think that when we take Christianity out of our sort of moral building, we can build it higher. Actually, I think it's more like pulling the pin on a grenade. The whole thing just goes up in your hand in smoke as soon as you pull Christianity out. We have no basis for saying that humans are equally morally valuable. We have no basis for saying that racism is wrong. We have no basis for saying rape is wrong. I mean, in the animal kingdom, you see rape all the time. It's sort of power of the weak over the strong. Sure, we have no basis for saying abortion is wrong, but we also have no basis for saying that the mother's life is valuable in the first place.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And you mentioned the exposing of infants back in more pagan times, where the Christian Revolution, as mentioned Tom Holland there, sort of turned things on its head. But maybe you could say that we are reverting back to more ancient pagan ways, and the exposing of children, and in the form of abortion, but also euthanasia and all these different things. The value of human life is just
There are serious moral philosophers today who are arguing in favor of infanticide. Because they're saying, honestly, if the baby in the womb isn't considered a human person, they'll make this distinction often between a human being, which all of us are, including the embryos, and human persons. And they say, well, if the human being in the mother's womb doesn't have these kind of capacities that we would associate with human personhood, then nor does the newborn, actually. So in all the circumstances where we would think that abortion was okay, regardless of whether there's any disability in the baby in the first place. Some would say, well, maybe if a baby is like severely disabled to where they weren't expected to live, or they'd be living in terrible pain. We're actually talking about, I think that's morally problematic in and of itself. But even setting that aside, there are folks arguing like a perfectly healthy baby who is just unwanted by their parents. It's not morally problematic to have a sort of post-birth, after-birth abortion, i.e. infanticide of that baby, which again, as you say, is exactly what was so common in the world into which Jesus was born. Yeah.
I think we've reached this part of our event. I just want to thank you for sort of comparing those two. We have these options, as you mentioned, the cross of Christ, which places the value of women equally to men, and then you have the sort of new pagan option, which doesn't look very good. Let's take a little break now, maybe 3 minutes or so, and we will return with some listener or viewer questions. Thank you, Rebecca.
Mång setter atrona og kristne trunna i samband vi skjeil avvarskan av øystegninger og samfunnet. Tui ber heimskjente sangaren John Lennon og kom umynda og en bedre heim vi ungon atrona i. Framstandande at gjestar hava 17 årene sagt just det samme, og tar av særlig funnet seg av kristne trunne, tui hei heimri ikke verinek bedre utan henne. Trui det nasto torskvöldene færre det hitja narri at det som spurninge ut fra imisko vinklom. 24. november vil Samrøða vid rithøvundan Rebecca McLaughlin spurningen Niðurger Kristna trúgvin kvinnur. 1. desember fikk Glenn Harrison, som professor emeritus i psykiatri, at hava en fyrirlestur evne det salarlig ausund at trúgva god. Og 8. desember vil Samrøða vi heimskjente ikkje-kristna søvefrøyingen og rithøvundan Tom Holland spurningen brøyte kristna trúgvin heimen til det betra. Öll kvöldene har hitjar en möjliga att sända spurningar in. Fylg vi av KFS Føroyar av Facebook för mer kunning.
All right. So Rebecca, you can hear me?
I can.
Yeah, great. That's if you couldn't, then we couldn't do this. All right. So we've received a couple of questions, and let's just take the first one, which says, the Bible mostly speaks of man and he, maybe generally, but also specifically about God. Is there something special about men that makes them worthy to be the gender identified with God? 95% of the time, maybe.
Do you know, that's a great question. It's one that my daughters, I've got two daughters who are 10 and 8, and a little son who's 2.5. And my 8-year-old was asking me a question along these lines the other day. So we tend to assume, we sort of start with our framework, which is that there are male and female humans, and that's kind of a starting point for how we think about God. The more I read the Bible and the more I kind of think about how the Bible works, we've actually got that the wrong way around. We start with God, and then we look at his creation through those eyes. And one of the things that God does, which is so beautiful and extraordinary, is that he actually makes living metaphors to help us understand a little bit about himself and how he loves us. And one of the famous metaphors we have in the Bible is the idea of God as Father, which is sort of a male metaphor, right? We see that somewhat in the Old Testament. We see it very clearly when Jesus starts talking to God as his Father and inviting us to do that. And that tells us that the best human father possible gives us a tiny little glimpse of how it means, how God loves us. But actually the Bible also uses maternal metaphors for God. So whereas God always uses sort of masculine pronouns in the Bible for himself, both the God as revealed in the Old Testament and actually Jesus are very comfortable using feminine metaphors to describe themselves. So one of my favorite is in the book of Isaiah, when God says to his people through the prophet Isaiah, can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. This picture of God as a breastfeeding mother, loving us with that kind of tender affection. Or Jesus saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often have I longed to gather you to me, your children to me, as a mother hen gathers her little chicks. We see God saying to his people in the Old Testament, have you forgotten the rock who gave you birth? Like using these very sort of female metaphors. So we see both in our lived experience of human fatherhood and human motherhood, we get little glimpses of what it means for God to love us. But then, as I mentioned earlier, we have human marriage presented as this particular picture or metaphor for Jesus's love for his people. And whereas it's true that in the Bible, God is referred to by masculine pronouns, it's also true that in the Bible, all of us, if we're trusting in Jesus, all of us, whether we're male or female, are part of the bride of Christ. That there's this, it might be kind of awkward for me as a woman to get my head around the fact that in biblical terms, I am actually a son of God, because in the terms of the Bible, it was sons who inherited in that culture. So I'm both a child of God, but I'm still actually kind of specifically a son of God, as well as being in a different sense a daughter of God. But actually you, as a man, are part of the bride of Christ. So again, we tend to sort of start with our own ideas of sex and gender, and then sort of imagine God kind of working from that. And actually, we sort of need to flip that around and think, okay, what story was God trying to tell as he wove these different pictures into our lived experiences as human beings? And I think, we get glimpses of God's love for us through these various different kinds of human relationships, and part of that depends on thinking in metaphorical terms about male and female.
You talked a little bit about submission before the break. This word that Paul uses that sounds a little bit sinister. It's a difficult word to sort of salvage, maybe. You talked about what it means biblically, but there's a question here about what does it mean practically, like in the 21st century? Maybe, I don't know if you're up to talking about what it means to you in your life, but what does it mean?
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to. Just before I do, though, I want folks to do a little mental experiment. So this idea of submission comes up in a few different actually passages in the New Testament, but Ephesians chapter 5 is a particularly good example.
Yeah.
Whereas I mentioned earlier, wives are called to submit to their husbands as the church submits to Christ. Husbands are told to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Imagine if we took the same text, but we just switched around husbands and wives. And so it was saying, wives, give yourselves up for your husbands as Christ sacrificed himself on the cross. How would that feel to us as we sort of think in terms of gender and the way in which women have been oppressed and abused historically and today, including in the intimate relationships? That would actually be much more of a kind of mandate for abuse than what the Bible actually says, which is husbands love your wives, 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 husbands honor your wives in 1 Peter and empathize with them. The repeated command to husbands is to love their wives, not to lead them, not to rule over them, not to make them submit to them, but to love them and to love them sacrificially like Jesus loves the church. So that just to frame that, then a question of, what on earth does submission look like in the 21st century? And, how does this play out practically for me? Happy to talk about that. I have the privilege of being married to a lovely Christian man, a sinner saved by grace, like any other Christian man. So certainly not perfect, but someone who is, trying to love the Lord and follow the Lord himself and trying to love me as Christ loved the church. And it plays out practically in a few different ways. So, for example, theologically, I'm someone who believes that babies ought to be baptized, the children of Christians ought to be baptized in infancy. And that's my kind of understanding of the Bible. My husband doesn't have that same understanding. And so our children didn't get baptized as babies.
Okay.
Now, that's fine from my perspective, because actually Brian will answer to the Lord for whether our children were baptized as babies or not. He's actually kind of ultimately responsible for that decision. Not that we don't have conversations about it, but at the end of the day, it's his responsibility. Or likewise, if we're thinking about how much of our money to give away and to which causes and needs we should be giving it. I very much participate in those conversations, very, very actively. But at the end of the day, he's going to answer to the Lord for how much money we gave away. And to sort of put an even more kind of positive spin on this, because I realize some of that might be a bit hard for people to get their heads around. Any folks listening in who've been a Christian for a while, one of the things that we as Christians long for is guidance from God, right? Like if you have a big decision coming up, should you take this job or that job? Should you go to this place or that place? How should you act in this difficult relational situation you're in? All of us long for sort of personalized direction from the Lord. And we read the Bible and we look for wisdom there. We pray for insight. But if you are a Christian woman married to a Jesus-loving Christian man, as I am, I can ask Brian for advice in a situation. And actually, because of the promises of God in the scriptures, I can recognize that that's guidance from the Lord. Now, I want to be careful. There are certainly situations where someone could sort of abuse that right, and there are abusive relationships where people have used various Christian texts out of context to put women in really bad situations. And I think in any verse of the Bible, if you just pluck it out of context and don't read it in light of the rest of the scriptures, we're going to misunderstand it, right? So I don't want to be misheard as saying women in abusive marriage relationships or should just do whatever their husbands tell them to do. I don't think that's what the Bible says at all. However, I do think one of the blessings of being a Christian woman and of being married to a Christian man is that I can actually, I have a sort of extra insight into God's will for my life because I can ask Brian for his wisdom.
There's a question about what is your position in regards to women in ministry? Can women participate to the same extent as men can, or is there a difference there?
As I understand the scriptures, there are some differences. As I said, I think people, various theologians who I respect, fall in different precise places in terms of how this plays out. But I think it does play out somehow. For me, I wouldn't be comfortable going to a church where the senior pastor was a woman, for example. Though I'd absolutely be comfortable with having multiple women on a staff team in a whole variety of roles. When I have been, I mean, again, I'm just speaking purely personally, so take what I have to say with a grain of salt. In the last couple of years, if the senior pastor of a church has asked me to come and speak to his congregation on a Sunday morning, I've taken the view that, like, really, it's his responsibility to decide who should and shouldn't be speaking in his church. And he'll answer to the Lord for this decision, actually, as well. So a little bit like how I think about in my marriage relationship. Yeah. So I've accepted those invitations. Now, again, I'm not saying this is necessarily either my final word on the question or should be everybody's final word. But I do feel comfortable, for the reasons I've explained, with the idea that men and women might play certain different roles, while also recognizing that women's gospel ministry has always been the absolute fertilizer of the church, and has represented the majority of Christian ministry throughout all of time. And as far as I have no particular reason to believe this is going to change in the coming years.
So senior pastor is out of the question, but preaching on Sunday morning, teaching, is that open to women's participation?
Yeah, as far as I can see, within that framework. Now, again, I think we hear that in our sort of comfortable Western contexts, and we think, that's a status thing, right? Like, only men get to be senior pastors. Like, isn't that great for them? In the first century, and in much of the global church today, being the senior pastor or an elder of a church means that you're the first one to be hauled off to prison. You're the first one at risk of martyrdom. You're the first one who gets beaten up, as Paul and the apostles were in the marketplace. It's not about power and privilege. It's about service and sacrifice.
That's a very interesting point. One critique that's sometimes leveled, I've heard some of the new atheists say this, is that the only reason that Christianity doesn't denigrate women right now is because Christianity has been defanged, right? It had a lot of power in the past because of the Enlightenment, because of various developments in Western history. It has lost that power. And it doesn't denigrate women but in spite of itself. And if it ever gained all that power back, then it would start denigrating women again. I mean, we see the popularity of The Handmaid's Tale, all that sort of stuff. That speaks to that sort of anxiety there, or maybe that view of what Christianity is really about. So it's been liberalized, but by secular power, not because there's anything inherently Christian about not denigrating women. How do you respond to a critique like that?
Well, the Handmaid's Tale example is almost funny. Let me tell you why. I mean, it's sort of tragically funny. And again, I was just writing about this very morning. So one of because there was a Hulu adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale a couple of years ago, it's become sort of very much in the popular imagination in America, and especially, and I guess there's in other places as well. Yeah. And so, one way in which people protest against the pro-life movement is to sort of dress up in the outfits of the handmaids in The Handmaid's Tale. And for those who are not familiar with the story, the idea is Margaret Atwood, who's a Canadian novelist, was imagining if New England, where I live, had been taken over by this sort of pseudo-Christian sect called the Sons of Jacob. And in this sort of semi-apocalyptic world, after some kind of nuclear fallout, most women had become infertile. But there are a certain number of women who weren't, and they were designated handmaids. And high-status men got to be commanders, and high-status women got to be commanders' wives. And then in a monthly ceremony, these handmaids would, under the sort of supervision of the wives, have sex with the commanders in the hope of producing a baby. Now, this is somehow sort of presented in people's minds as like, if we really let Christians get their hands on things, this is where we'd end up. Yeah. But the irony is, that is precisely the kind of thing that Christianity banned in the first place. In the Greco-Roman world, it was completely normal for men to sleep not just with their wives, but also with prostitutes and with male and female slaves.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of bizarre innovations of Christianity was to say that actually men had to be faithful to one wife and they couldn't sleep with their slaves. So this idea that if we really started listening to these Christians and with their biblical beliefs, we'd end up in a world where, basically sex slavery was enforced, is like literally the opposite of what Christianity is about.
Yeah. It's I read the book a couple of years ago. It's a good story, but the message isn't that good, in my opinion. A question is, what do you think the presidency of Donald Trump and the fact that a majority of evangelical Christians in the States supported him, what do you think that means to the credibility of Christian witness, maybe particularly in the States, but maybe overall today?
Yeah. I personally find it extremely troubling. And I think it's profoundly sad how many Christian leaders have supported a man who honestly stands against pretty much everything that they really believe in, or certainly should do from a biblical perspective. I think the pro-life issue has been sort of tactically used politically to sort of open the door to this. But really the idea that Donald Trump sort of represents any kind of Christian values writ large seems almost laughable. Again, I think it's sort of tragic. It's tragic, so it doesn't make me laugh, but actually it's sort of somewhat laughable. One of the profoundly sad and lamentable things about the history of America is that whereas America was in one sense sort of founded on freedom, it was actually also in another strong sense founded on slavery. And one of the really painful things for me in the last 12 years of living in America has been sort of understanding more about the history of America and how that plays out today in terms of the church's historic complicity in racism. One of the, that's on one hand profoundly sad and discouraging to me as a Christian. What on the other hand is profoundly encouraging is the fact that actually Black Americans are the most Christian folk in town. In particular, Black women, actually, both in America and globally, women of color are the most likely to identify as Christians. And in America, Black people are more likely to go to church than their white peers. They're more likely to read the Bible. They're more likely to pray. They're more likely to say they believe in, core sort of evangelical beliefs about the scriptures. So when people look at America today and they hear statistics about 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, for example, and there are clearly significant problems that's revealing, we tend to forget that actually the most Christian demographic in America is Black Americans who, for various reasons, almost in the vast majority vote Democrat. Now, I think what's tragic is that sort of legitimately Christian values have been sort of spread out between the two main parties in America rather than being sort of pulled together into a cohesive whole. So I feel deeply grieved by the way in which I think white Christian complicity with some totally unacceptably unchristian ways of thinking, speaking, and acting have been, going down in the last few years. But I feel hopeful for the church to grow beyond this. And I'm encouraged by, I don't know if folks are familiar with John Piper, a very prominent sort of white evangelical theologian over here who's written very clear-sightedly about the sinful character that we've seen in the White House in the last 4 years and how this doesn't justify, for all the sort of pro-life rhetoric, it doesn't actually justify supporting a man who stands for so many things that Christians shouldn't stand for and believe.
Yeah. How would you answer the skeptic who grants you that, sure, Jesus' message was very progressive for the time, if that's a word we can use, but now, 2,000 years later, things have moved forward, they've moved on, and we have at best outgrown the need for Christianity, and at worst, Christianity would denigrate women.
I mean, I'd sort of want to say, well, okay, let's look at any legitimate measure of this and see if that statement is true. We've already talked about how women who go to church once a week or more are measurably happier, less suicidal, healthier. I mean, again, I want to be careful. Of course, it has always been the case that some Christians have struggled with severe and debilitating depression, and that's not because they, aren't faithful enough Christians. People like Charles Spurgeon, great heroes of the faith, who've struggled with chronic depression. So I'm not trying to say, become a Christian and all your struggles with depression or suicidal thoughts would go away. But if we're looking just at sort of purely overall demographic terms, Christianity is measurably good for humans in general and women in particular. If we want to think in terms of sort of more global questions, it seems to me that we are desperately in need, and we continue to be desperately in need of something that will bind people of different racial, ethnic, national, cultural backgrounds together and give them a sense of sort of brotherhood and sisterhood across all these kinds of divisions. And absolutely the front contender for that prize is Christianity. And actually whereas people who grew up, where I grew up and where I live now tend to think that the big question for the next generation is, how soon will religion die out? The big question is actually Christianity or Islam. Those are the two 10-ton gorillas sort of in the field at the moment. And if we look at women's rights and equality, we find that Christianity does far better, even from sort of a clear-sighted secular perspective than Islam does. Likewise, compare it to Hinduism, the next largest global belief system. Christianity really has changed how women are viewed and valued.
Yeah. There's a question here about, there is this widespread impression that the Bible says that women have less value than men, and they don't deserve as much respect because of that. Maybe we can broaden it and say some of the more, I don't know, you present a very good case that Christianity, properly understood, doesn't denigrate women, but there are many people that do have opinions that do seem to, and not just opinions, but practices that do seem to denigrate women, and they see them as being Christian. How do you sort of fight the good fight, and how can we join you, if I can phrase it like that?
Yeah, a really good place to start is to read our Bibles carefully. People often don't read their Bibles carefully. This has resulted, for example, in people having the idea that Christianity is basically a white, centered Western religion, when it never has been, and as far as I can tell, never will be. We see black believers from the book of Genesis onwards. And I think when it comes to women in particular, we need to make sure that we're actually going back to what the scriptures say, rather than sort of co-opting scriptures to our own cultural ends, even if we think that we're sort of doing it in the name of Christianity. I went to a women's conference a few years ago in which the sweet woman who clearly loved Jesus was speaking, but I don't think she'd really thought carefully about what was biblical and what was gender stereotyped. And she said, let's think about, I want you to think about men and women's roles like this. Imagine we're trying to build a skyscraper. And she said, the men are the architects and the builders, and they go and they build the structure itself. And then the women come in and they hang the pictures and they, make it look pretty on the inside. And I thought, I literally have no idea where you're going in the Bible to find that. I mean, I don't see that anywhere in the scriptures. I do see, as I say, I see men and women called in particular contexts to specific roles in the scriptures. A little bit like if I were auditioning to play, Juliet in the play Romeo and Juliet, I'd be given a script rather than just sort of making it up for myself. I think there are particular roles that we're called to play, but it's always based on Christ-centered theology rather than sort of gendered psychology. And I think people tie themselves in all sorts of strange knots when they try to ground things in gender stereotypes, which I don't think the Bible asks us to do.
Okay. And then there's the final question. Would you identify as a feminist? Should Christians identify with that movement? And can we say that Jesus was a feminist?
Yes, and yes, but with some caveats. I would identify as a feminist. The technical definition of a feminist is somebody who would advocate for the equal rights of women on the basis of the equality of the sexes. I believe that women are fundamentally equal to men, and I believe that because I'm a Christian, not in spite of it. I do not believe that some of the things that have been sort of wrapped up in feminism more recently, for example, a woman's supposed right to choose an abortion, I strongly oppose those things. And the reality is that many sort of secular feminists today wouldn't want me in their party, kind of thing, because of some of the things that I believe. But actually, I don't think that's my fault. If it's like, I actually think that the word feminist should have room for people like me who believe that women are fundamentally equal to men. And actually, even if you look at the kind of roots of the feminist movement, the arguments were made on the basis of what the Bible tells us about men and women. Now, at the same time, I perfectly respect people today who wouldn't want to identify as a feminist because of the ways in which people hear that word today. I'm all about, I tend to prefer to kind of reclaim words rather than to kind of concede them when things are put into the definition that I don't think belong there. Was Jesus a feminist? In the sense of believing in the equality of men and women, absolutely. In the sense of being the person who lifted women up, in some instances actually to shame self-righteous men, definitely. In the sense that he seems to have called more women to follow him throughout the centuries than he's called men. Yeah, I would say so. Which again, none of that is to denigrate men. No. And people, sometimes get that impression. Equality isn't about denigrating men either. I actually think one of the liberating things about being a Christian, whether we're a man or a woman, is that we can know that we are fully known and truly loved. We don't have to worry about whether we sort of fit as a man or a woman, because we know that God has made us so, and that he's given us, in some circumstances, he's given us particular roles to play. I think in the vast majority of circumstances and situations that men and women, can play kind of the same roles. It's not that, for example, we have multiple instances in the Bible of women having paid jobs outside the home and that not being at all problematic from a Christian perspective, though, some Christians have sneered at that in recent years. It's not a biblical thing. Lydia, one of the first Christians in Philippi, was a seller of purple goods. We see tent makers in the scriptures. We see the ideal wife described in Proverbs 31, who clearly earns money outside the home. So some of the sort of cultural ideas we have about what the Bible says about women don't actually turn out to be there in the way that we think they are. So yeah, I'm happy to say I'm a feminist, and I think in a meaningful sense, Jesus would say the same.
Fully known and fully loved. I think that's a really good point to conclude this discussion, this conversation. Rebecca, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. It's been really interesting to have you here with us. Thank you for the time that you have given us this evening, and all the best to you and your family.
Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. But one more thing I forgot.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you're working on a new book. Can you give us 30 seconds about what's that all about?
I can, yeah. Where I live in America, there are lots of what are called yard signs, sort of cardboard things people stick up in their front gardens, which say things like, in this house we believe that Black Lives Matter, love is love, women's rights are human rights, and then there are usually 2 or 3 other claims that can vary from sign to sign, but the first 3 are pretty consistent. So I'm writing a book that is looking at those claims and looking at what Christians do and don't agree with about them and how we can move forward. So the 5 claims I'm looking at are Black Lives Matter, love is love, the gay rights movement is the new civil rights movement, women's rights are human rights, and transgender women are women, which is an emerging claim.
So steering well clear of all the controversial stuff out there.
Exactly.
Cool. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Hatta var det for i kvöld. Som sagt, helt i början så kommande torskvöld så halda vi fram i oss røyene om kristendommer, eller kristentrygg skælig. Ta vi da en fyrlester og Q&A som kvöld. Vi har en som heter Glyn Harrison om spurningen som til salarliga osunt at trykva av god. Glyn Harrison, han professor emeritus, det vil si fyrværende undervisande, og i psykiatri av Bristol University i England. Her som han også arbeid som rådgivende psykiatere og løyer av døltene for psykiatri. Han ser av virkjen i tjejen om trygg salarfrøye og salarsjukofrøye. Her så har han skrivet flere bøker, middelandet en som heter The Big Ego Trip, Finding True Significance in a Culture of Self-Esteem. Så även til det salarliga osunt at trykva av god. Og til kommande torskvöld som at samma sted, hvis man kan si det på tammatan. Inni av Facebook så inne i KFS Føroyar så kunne du finne et tiltak som er i neste viko. Her kunne du velge at du atla lodtaka, så at du kunne få en avmenning om når det begynner. Somleis kunne du løsne bjau øron vi til at hitje etter livestream. Jeg vet at det flere som samla i imenskon fysisk støvun i havn, og et shout-out til tikkun som sitter i Philadelphia i Køste på nå. Det kanskje også godt husk at det bjau omkring vi til det neste viko. Så best etter å si takk for i kvöld. God for vittikon, og vi suggest venande kommande torskvöld klokkan 8.
Mång setter atrona og kristna trunna i samband vi skæl avskan av øystekninger og samfunnet. Tui ber heimskjente sangaren John Lennon og kom umynda med bedre heim vi ungdom atrona i. Framstandande at gjestar hava 17 årene sagt just det samme, og tar av særlig funnet seg at kristna trunne, tui hei heimri ikke verenig bedre utan henne. Trui det nasto torskvöldene fervde hitja narri at det som spurringer ut fra imensko vinklon. 24. november vil Samrøða vid rithøvundan Rebecca McLaughlin om spurningen Niðurger Kristna trúgvin kvinnur. 1. desember fikk Glyn Harrison, som professor emeritus i psykiatri, at hava en fyrirlestur om evne det salarlig osunt at trúgva god. Og 8. desember vil Samrøða vid heimskjente ikke-kristna søvefrøyingen og rithøvundan Tom Holland om spurningen brøyte kristna trúgvin heimen til det betra. Öll kvöldene har hitjar en möjliga att sända spurningar in. Fylg vi av KFS Føroyar av Facebook för mer kunning.